was the head of Euclid, and now he's left. And so I think he's totally retired now. So they're looking for a new person. But Euclid was set up, and it has a California section, but it was set up for agencies to put money into that can then be spent on appropriate projects. And so I don't know what kind of state legislation there is, if there's any, but anyway, they might be, it would be infinitely better than trying to give it to David or give it to resources that were fishing game. I mean, they just are fishing. They just aren't. It's beyond.
I think that's what cat raising.
Right. It's just, it'll never happen if they need to take action. But it was already set up, and they're used to working with Chris, Mike Chris, he used to be one of the head of it. And actually, Martha Davis got interviewed for the replacement research. I don't know how that's going. So, I actually had not got, I was unclear about that intake thing, is locking in technology. That's security.
What I was trying to say is that, yeah, it's in one way it's a little different, but it's kind of like our house.
We do it all the time.
And every intake structure in the city.
Exactly. So I wonder how long it'll be interesting to see what Bruce comes up with in terms of career life of these in the ocean environments are very corrosive. What would be the lifetime of somebody we can take care of this by instead of having PBS reopener, it would be if you're in a place. There are two more, so we've got 12, but I think we can make it start out. And then they can fly home. No, that's true. It's important for you to know. I'm just princess. I'm just princess. In our house.
You're a what?
Princess. I'm the princess.
You're a princess?
I'm a princess. Yes.
Oh, well, that's
That's
nice.
why I have to be obeyed.
You get treated like a princess? Oh, lucky you.
I think we're back.
I sometimes have to remind
I get treated like an indentured servant.
No, they're back.
remember,
They're
the
back.
princess. We're not.
Yeah.
You may wear the pants and the I'm the princess.
Well, good.
So I
That's
trust
nice.
you've all had productive conversations. That's always good. Couple more. Okay. Oh. Now,
Before you go.
next up, the reason I said it that way is I have them in an order that started with you, Joe. And then I have Joe followed by Catherine Pease, then Haley Percy, then Jen Eckerly, and then Sean Bothwell. If you want to go in a different order, you guys just let me know, since it's, the magic paperclip that tells me that there's some request. All right.
we're not all that well organized to know which order we should go in.
You know, I'm just assuming.
Safe assumption. Thanks for, like everyone earlier, thanks for holding this workshop. It really is great to have a chance to talk about this stuff before the train has left the station.
Well, for us, part of the value, I know some people, we're doing it on a number of issues at the same time, where we have workshop, then we have the public comments, then we have the decision hearing. People are wondering why we're doing it so much. And I really do think, and the staff believe, that if you have this ongoing evolution and conversation, then it allows the comments to be much more focused, and the conversation that we all have collectively more focused than the sort of Emily Latella arena where everybody has to address what it is that, I'm dating myself, you're nodding, some people are like, what is she talking about? I'm not going to explain it. It's prerogative of age. And then all that really precious human life force is spent arguing past each other, and our goal is really just to have the best evolving conversation so we get to the best answers. So thank you for all the time.
Well, that means I'm going to have to rewrite my comments. So just for the record, my name's Joe Geaver, and I represent the Surfrider Foundation. And I guess I'll start off with this, that we very much agree with the intent of the draft, but think that just from experience, that there's so many loopholes in this thing in the attempt to have flexibility that the exceptions kind of swallow the rule. So let me start with the basics, because there was some discussion about this. The law requires best available site design, technology, and mitigation to minimize intake and mortality of all forms of marine life. Best available means something. The way this agency and others interpret and enforce that language is a common three-step process with built-in flexibility. First, you define the technology that's the best. You set a performance standard based on that effectiveness. And then you allow technologies that meet or exceed that performance standard.
Okay.
That's what the state board did for the intakes in the OTC policy, and has done for many regulations of discharges. And it enforces two policies embedded in the laws. First, best available will change over time, and the regulations should be designed to encourage innovation and improvement. And second, the focus on point of source technology moved us away from this old standard of attempting to monitor degradation in a water body and assess those cumulative degradation to many dischargers, and it moved it to a discharge standard, or in this case, an intake standard. And that's what we see in the draft in regards to the discharge. Diffusers are the best technology, the performance standard is set by that effectiveness, and then other alternatives are allowed to meet that performance standard. It's a little unusual to set the performance standard with one technology and then choose the other for the preferred alternative, but we understand that that's based on this hypothesis that diffusers may entrain marine life. Fair enough. I think that's a precautionary approach to this thing, and we support precautionary approaches. Mm-hmm. But if we're going to use a precautionary approach, it should be the whole rule. But that's not what we're doing with the intake. We know, and nobody disagrees, that subsurface wells are the best technology for minimizing intake and mortality. And the difference between subsurface wells and subsurface galleries is that galleries include temporary mortality and displacement during construction and maintenance. Mm-hmm. Arguably the second best alternative. But screens, fine mesh screens, whatever screens, is significantly more impact. It's not, I guess you could argue it's the third best alternative. It's actually closer to open intakes than it is to subsurface intakes. It's a far distant third best, if it's best at all. But we understand that the draft was written to account for the difference in the language in Port of Cologne. That is, Port of Cologne does say best available, but does not say best available technology alone. It says best available site design, technology, and mitigation. We don't disagree that best available should attach to each element and a combination of elements. if that combination of elements is enforced to collectively result in minimizing intake and mortality of all forms of marine life. And the rule does and should give more weight to site design and technology. I'll get to the restorative measures in a minute, but let's look at that combination of site design and technology. In our experience, there are several ways to approach a combination of these elements. For example, the Sand City, Ocean View Plaza, Cal-Am Monterey projects all started with the assumption that wells were the best technology, then ensured that the site and design of the facility were compatible with that technology. In other words, the elements themselves and the combination of the elements resulted in minimizing intake and mortality. But if you look at Carlsbad Poseidon or Poseidon Huntington, they took a very different approach. They chose the cheapest site and a predetermined design first, and then compared intake technologies that were quote unquote feasible. And feasibility was primarily about cost. There was no consideration of how the elements were compatible or not. If you don't ensure the elements are compatible and work together, you're trying to squeeze a square peg in a round hole. You end up with almost entirely after-the-fact restoration measures. When you compare these projects, which all arguably look at site design, technology, and mitigation in combination, but not compatibility, you end up with very different results. That's why we say the exceptions swallow the rule. This is where they're going with this notion of site-specific best available. The site has little or nothing to do with minimizing intake and mortality. So the best technology available wouldn't be required. It's site-specific. It's kind of funny to say site-specific and not have the best site for minimizing intake. The whole thing starts to collapse, right? You don't get where you want to go.
Do you see a distinction between dealing with a facility like with a conditional approval like Carlsbad and new ones in the future? Or are you saying that the way this is written, it never suggests that people should go to a site where subsurface is appropriate if they don't want to?
Look, I think Carlsbad is kind of an exception. It is where it is. I don't know that we can do anything about choosing a better site. I think it's clear that if you combine these elements, you wouldn't be at Carlsbad. But being that they're already invested in that site, there may be something you can do about the technology to kind of minimize. But really, in the future, you want to look at these elements in combination,
right. And that's
and
what
they're
I'm
compatible.
trying to eliminate. So you're saying the way it's written, when we say the best combination, setting aside Carlsbad, which is so far along, we're not paying enough attention to location in the way it's written.
I think that if I had to put a word on it, we're not paying enough attention to compatibility, how these different elements in combination are compatible with each other, right?
Mm-hmm. Right. Right, because the holistic approach seems smart to looking at all of them.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. And if you just say combination without any kind of definition of what that means, you can twist it around to mean whatever you want it to mean and not necessarily minimize the intake and mortality of marine life. Let's see, this is a little redundant now. So we think there are changes to the draft that can tighten up some of the loopholes and ensure the intent is realized going forward. We're going to prepare comments. We're going to give you some textual changes that kind of tighten this stuff up and get you where we think the intent is. And I guess just for a broader kind of big scope comment, I was raised a commercial fisherman. I know what this stuff means. I know what it means to try and manage resources that you really don't understand. I lived through the collapse of fisheries. I feel in part responsible for that. You don't want to live with that kind of responsibility. Believe me, you want to get this stuff right. We're doing a lot. We're cutting back on our fishery quotas. We're putting in MPAs, doing everything we can do to reduce polluted discharges to the ocean. Really, we're taking all these steps. And the OTC policy, really, we're transforming the whole generating fleet to eliminate this intake and mortality. Look, I hear a lot of conversation about, the reliability factor of ocean desal. In my mind, I compare it to the delta. Like, we designed that delta system without taking into consideration the environmental impacts. Now that we see the fisheries collapsing, we've got to, it's a really difficult thing to fix the delta. Let's not put ourselves into that situation with desal. Let's learn from our mistakes. And we're not insensitive to, water management reform that ensures reliability and sustainability. There's lots of things we can do. You guys have already identified it. Advancing recycled wastewater, stormwater capture, all this stuff. Really, those are multi-benefit approaches, and we should be doing those, right? So anyway, I'm going to cut this short because seems like you already got where I was going before I said it.
I just wanted to be sure I understood it. I can focus.
But if you guys have any questions, I'm happy to give it a shot.
I'll ask you a question.
Sure.
Was reminded of a multi-benefit scenario in the last one of the last speakers about if an extraction trench is needed to combat seawater intrusion, there might be an opportunity to reuse that water beneficially. Do you think there's some examples, where we can try to combine, a new source of domestic supply in addition to seawater intrusion management?
I do think so. I think that the seawater intrusion answer is both a function of kind of where we're going with the MS4 permits and trying to introduce stormwater capture on site rather than it running off of property. In the right place that recharges your groundwater naturally, which is something we could do in a multi-benefit approach of reducing pollutant loading and recharging our groundwater basins. And recycled water, to the extent that you need to pump it into the groundwater basin to fend off seawater intrusion, I think that's, a good use. I'm a big advocate of direct potable reuse because I think of the cost reductions and the volumes that you can get, but not to the exclusion of recharging our groundwater basins. I think you have to do both, right? So I don't know if that answers your question. Or
I appreciate you, using examples, to illustrate the multi-benefit. I just thought that was, one example of if that's found to be the needed engineering solution for a specific area to do an extraction trench, then there's a production of water that might be beneficially reused and infrastructure put in place to do that.
yeah, I think that's right.
Interesting.
Okay.
Thank you very
Thank
much.
you.
Next, Catherine Pease from Heal the Bay, followed by Haley Percy of the Southern California Watershed Alliance.
Good morning, board members. My name is Catherine Pease, and I'm here representing Heal the Bay. We commend the State Water Board for moving forward to establish a desalination policy through the Ocean Plan Amendment process, and we appreciate the opportunity to weigh in. We are currently reviewing the draft, and we plan to submit detailed written comments by the deadline. Today, we want to highlight 3 particular issues of concern: the need to establish best technology available, a review of fine mesh screens, and the restoration calculation. First, as the State Board has previously concluded with the once-through cooling policy, having statewide standards for best technology available is the best way to ensure that there is a consistent application of the law throughout the state, as well as consistent protection of marine habitat. While the regional boards are well suited to review individual desalination applications, providing the regional boards with a set of consistent standards will help ensure that best technology available is applied consistently. We are concerned that the draft as written does not establish the best technology available and instead leaves interpretation up to the individual regional boards. Our concerns about fine mesh screens are multifaceted. First, we'd like some clarity if the draft is referring to cylindrical wedge wire screens, a fine mesh screen to replace traditional mesh trash screens, or something else.
Okay.
We recall that power plants studying cylindrical wedge wire screens during the 316B review, and our memory is that EPRI and others found that they were ineffective in the marine environment. We think that this is consistent with our concerns in this current draft.
So is there a one that's, I'm sorry, because I wasn't here during OTC, is another kind of mesh screen better? Or is it just you don't like screens?
Not that I'm aware of. This issue is a little bit new to me, but from what I understand is that this kind of mesh has not been tested well in marine environments. The theory of a cylindrical screen housing is that the shape will create something like a hydraulic foil that carries larvae and eggs over the top of the housing, minimizing both entrainment and impingement. Our understanding of the engineering is that these screen housings are somewhat effective in rivers, primarily because the velocity of the oncoming water current is high relative to the velocity of the intake, and that the direction of the flow is constant. Of course, the direction of ocean currents, tides, and wave surge is constantly changing, so alignment of the housing into oncoming currents is impossible. Similarly, the approach velocity of ocean currents, tides, and wave surges constantly changes. But what's a big concern of ours is that the draft sets the intake velocity at a half foot per second. That's an intake velocity set by EPA to minimize the impingement of marine life that has developed swimming capability. Tests have shown that most fish can swim away from that velocity and avoid impingement on the screen. Obviously, this isn't the case for young developing organisms who are exposed to entrainment. And it would seem extremely rare to find a circumstance in the ocean where the approach velocity would be faster than the intake velocity, and so the foil theory would fail. We will be looking more closely at the efficacy of these screens. We think the data provided in the environmental document is evidence that there is no foil effect and that organisms of small sizes come in contact with the screens. Those smaller than the screen mesh are sucked into the intake, and those larger than the mesh size are washed away. And that raises unanswered questions about mortality rates. We don't know whether contact with the screens at different velocities will harm some organisms and result in mortality at some point.
Right.
We know some of these organisms are incredibly tough. Studies show that some fish eggs have survived the gauntlet of cooling water intake systems. But because EPA couldn't be certain those organisms would survive after being discharged, the agency assumed 100% mortality. We think some precautionary assumptions are necessary here as well. And given that precautionary approach, it's not clear that fine mesh screens significantly reduce the mortality of an open intake. And if fine mesh screens do not show proven results, we don't think they should be considered best available technology for minimizing intake and mortality of all forms of marine life. Finally, we have been re-reviewing the notion of restorative measures to fully compensate for the intake and mortality of all forms of marine life. We are concerned that each method for calculating the impact has some inherent risk and inaccuracy and underestimation. But we agree with Dr. Raimondi that of the choices available, ETM APF is superior to the alternatives. Still, we are concerned that the draft doesn't adequately ensure that a restoration project will result in replacement of all forms of marine life, and much less confidence of full replacement of the myriad species in an entrainment impingement study. The population samples and calculation of source water bodies assume that a very small sample of those species in the entrainment sample will be representative of the impacted species or habitats. There is an inherent risk in that assumption. And the risk is compounded when the model combines all the different species-specific APFs and averages them for the cumulative APF. It is clear that some of the species will be undercompensated and some overcompensated. We think increasing the confidence level may ameliorate some of these concerns, but not all of them. We still have ongoing concerns that restoration projects actually replace the same types of habitats and consequently replace the same species as those lost to intake and mortality. In the past, we have seen restoration projects that are wetland habitats calculated to replace marine species. We are very much in favor of wetland restoration for its own sake, but we think that coastal wetlands serve important functions in restoring the functions of marine ecosystem, but it's not a one-to-one relationship. It is not in-kind habitat creation or restoration. It is not even attempting to replace all forms of marine life lost to the intake. I'll just cut to our final conclusions here since I'm out of time. So we think that reliance on these after-the-fact restorative measures should be discouraged. There are too many unknowns to have a high level of confidence. To the extent that the rule relies on restorative measures, we would recommend consideration of amendments to the draft, tightening up the language on best available site, design, and technology to ensure minimizing the intake and mortality of all forms of marine life before it occurs. We think the rule needs a definition of not feasible, similar to the definition in the once-through cooling policy. Like the OTC policy, cost should not be a factor in feasibility analyses. Cost-benefit analyses are possible when we have no reliable knowledge of the ecological value of these species, much less a method for accurately monetizing ecosystem values. And finally, any restoration calculation should take a precautionary approach to ensure success. As we said earlier, there are inherent risks in the ETM APF calculations, and we'll be making suggestions before the hearing. One thought might be some sort of multiplier to compensate for not in-kind habitat in distant proximities. We'll be continuing to work more on the detailed comments and recommendations, and if you'd like to contact us in the meantime, we're happy to talk further, and we look forward to contributing to this and working with you in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Questions, Mr. Wetland, mitigation guy? Haley Percy, Southern California Watershed Alliance, followed by Jen Eckerly, NRDC.
Hi, my name is Haley Percy. I'm incredibly excited to be standing at this podium talking to you, so if I'm visibly vibrating, it's a combination of nerves and excitement, and I apologize and just ask you to bear with me.
It's kind of just a friendly conversation.
Yes. I'm representing the Southern California Watershed Alliance, and we advocate economic and environmental integrated water management and have an interest in how seawater desalination may or may not fit into that mission. Thank you for the opportunity to speak. We will submit more comprehensive comments in writing, but today we wanted to share a couple of concerns before you finish your work on the draft, in particular 2 interrelated issues. The first being the preference for brine dilution through mixing with wastewater treatment discharges, and the second, the apparent definition of feasibility that rests in part on showing a specific need for produced water. First, we think using treated wastewater for dilution needs further consideration. We understand that there is a lack of clear regulations for recycling wastewater, but we hope that regulatory clarity and the advancement of recycled wastewater is in our near future. Because in the grand scheme of things, it seems crazy to design a water supply system that spends an enormous amount of energy to transport water to Southern California, use it once, spend a lot of energy to purify that wastewater, and then discharge it into the ocean, which is what we're doing. And it's wasting fresh water and all the embedded energy that is in that fresh water. But the notion that we would mix that with brine and discharge it into the ocean and then pump it back out of the ocean to remove the brine and start over again is ludicrous. And in the big picture view, we are adding an astronomical amount of embedded energy and marine life mortality into the system, only to end up with about the same amount of fresh water we started with. We admit that our large-scale view is oversimplified, but that's the gist of what's happening. It is our understanding that the major concern with direct potable reuse is potential contamination of the supply system if the treatment plant malfunctions. And indirect potable reuse, which is what we're using, adds retention time and redundant treatment to overcome the contaminated concerns. But seawater desalination uses the same technology as recycled wastewater, and therefore has the same risk of malfunctioning. And if a desal facility malfunctions, the potable system will become contaminated with seawater, We understand that the contaminants are different and that the fail-safe systems may differ, but still seawater desal does not require the same retention times and redundant treatment as we require for indirect potable reuse at this time. We think the state board should consider this disparate treatment between the two and explain it in the environmental document. We have also looked at the goals in your already existing recycled wastewater policy, and we support the goals that you have to increase recycled water by 2 million acre feet by the year of 2030. But we are concerned that if the wastewater discharge allocated for brine dilution is allocated for brine dilution, that it will set up an irrational constraint to prioritizing recycled wastewater when DPR is finally available. We request a little more clarification and, if not, enforceable provisions in the desal amendment to ensure against this irrational result taking away from the recycled water policy. The second concern today is that the draft on infeasible in section 2B1, which alludes that if there is a need for water along with one other component, then best available design and best available site can fall to the wayside. We are not convinced that it's necessary to look at need as a consideration of best available design capacity or best available site. The law seems clear that the site and design capacity should be the best for minimizing intake and mortality of marine life. We think there is a lot of ways to better achieve a balance of supply and demand in water portfolio before building the largest desal facility on the Western Hemisphere, and we think project proponents to date have failed to consider a range of sites and designs when considering alternatives for adding desal to local portfolios. But the notion that showing a need for a certain site and or design capacity by simply pointing to an urban water management plan or general plan is a regulatory standard without any teeth. We know from history that general plans and urban water management plans can be amended at any time to include any need for a project. Yes, there's a vehicle for public input in an amendment to an urban water management plan, but it turns into a circular pointing of fingers, where water agencies say that the land use planners identify the need and land use planners say they relied on the water available in the urban water management plan. And it's not clear to us how the decision-making process has anything to do with siting and designing a facility to minimize marine life mortality. It just seems to be, it just seems to put in place an element of defining the infeasible that is capable of completely undermining the mandate to minimize the intake and mortality of marine life. From a water management perspective, we agree with our friends in the environmental community that this is an illusory provision. If the intent of the Ocean Plan Amendment is to create clear statewide standards for enforcement of section 13142.5b,
Well said.
this language is poisonous. And just to be clear, we're not pointing out a potential misuse of this provision. We've already seen project proponents use this tactic to argue against ensuring the best available site, design, and technology for minimizing intake and mortality of marine life. We hope the board will consider modifications to close up some loopholes in the draft. And in closing, we want to say that we support what seems to be the intent of the draft. We just think there are a number of necessary changes to ensure that the intent is enforceable.
Thank you very
Thank you.
much. Very good issues.
Yeah,
raised.
those are, the two
Very
issues. Those sound, I appreciate the presentation. Could the speaker come back up? Yes. So on the issue of treated wastewater for dilution, I think we all get the conceptual conundrum that you brought up. Are we, putting this higher in line in terms of relying on it in the long-term future? Because currently we recycle 13%. In our goals, and our recycle water policy would take us a much higher percentage. And yet, that's conceptual. I'm wondering how much you or the folks that are working on the suggested language, have you looked into really numbers about the demand that's potential for brine dilution versus, other, really the maximum amount of direct or indirect potable that could be realized from these areas? Because there is a diminishing return in terms of maximizing recycled water use because of issues like salinity.
Are there numbers out that?
Yeah,
about
because
how much-
it would be helpful to put that in context. If you could look at an area and I understand you wouldn't have that right now, but this is a workshop, you know, and we're talking about type of information. I think putting that volume of water in context, in a water budget context, would be helpful to that discussion.
Absolutely.
Because, you know, are we talking about, you know, to use money, are we talking about pennies or nickels or dollars in terms of actual volumes that would be needed to dilute in relation to water budget? Because I'm not, you know, without seeing more analysis, I don't know if this is conceptual fear or if this is real, you know, a real volume that would dent available resources for a local agency that's trying to be more self-reliant.
Yes. I'm not sure that numbers have been put out for how much recycled water you would need to use to dilute.
So I think, you know, that's important to add to that discussion, to give it context. You know, what are we talking here?
Well, our staff should be able to think about that.
Right.
You don't have to come up with it.
Absolutely. You know, but yeah, I mean, just for everyone in, you know, in the workshop format to consider.
Board Member Moore, would it be helpful for us, we have some existing brine discharges that from seawater intrusion projects that go into wastewater outfalls. We could take a look at what percentage that is and what percentage it would be when it stopped being available, you know, for dilution. So what kind of budget we have. It's hard to do conceptually on projects that aren't there, but we do have some existing projects that we can look into.
Yeah, I think the key issue is just, I don't think the intent of that is to discourage recycle, and we've already had a number of comments about it. Obviously, we want to recycle as much as possible, and you may or may not know, by 2016, we will be doing regulations for indirect potable reuse for surface water augmentation and a feasibility report on direct potable. So we're looking at that very, very closely. I think our goal is going to be, maybe we'll get in competition with Israel, go for 80%.
That's right.
But we're for maximizing recycling. So you don't want to have these odd, perverse incentives is not what's in mind. I think it's just the fact that from a discharge standpoint, it has some benefits. So
Yeah,
we'll look at the language to make sure we're not having perverse disincentives.
That's right. And that's one example. You know, there's other, we could talk about, you know, how recycled water is used beneficially in the state. And there is a debate about the current strategy of getting it out there, you know, onto turf. You know, and is that the highest, best use of even recycled water? You know, so I think on the big picture, you know, there's a near-term use of water, and then there's a long-term use of water. You know, and so
recycling water should be the priority.
Right, but in the near-term opportunity, I've done recycled water master planning. You know, the near-term opportunities aren't necessarily what we would all agree are the best possible uses, but it is an opportunity to put them to beneficial use. So I just, you know, there's the ideal, and then there's the short-term real. And so that's, I'm interested in that issue of using recycled water or whatever as diluent, you know, or diluting brine. I don't think that's precluding long-term beneficial reuse in other ways. You know, just like a golf course isn't.
It just seems a little bit like just a waste of the water. But I understand what you're saying, sorry.
No, it's okay. That's part of the discussion. You know,
No, thanks for flagging the issue. We have to think about that.
I'm sorry, what?
Thank you for flagging it. We have to think about that as we move forward. And then on feasibility, mitigation, et cetera, we'll look forward to the comments. Hi.
Good morning, Chair Marcus and
Okay.
members of the board.
One second, Jen, if you don't, Jen
Yeah.
Eckerly, after you, Sean Bothwell.
Okay. I'm Jen Eckerly, and I'm an ocean policy consultant for the Natural Resources Defense Council. And we appreciate the opportunity to provide initial comments on the Water Board's draft desalination amendments. We support the testimony by our colleagues here, and we'll focus our comments on the policy as it relates to marine protected areas, or MPAs. We'd like to begin by commending the board and its staff for your ongoing leadership in the integration of MPAs and water quality issues, so thank you for that.
I wanted to give all the money to MPAs, but apparently we can't do
We
that.
love that.
I love MPAs.
As you know, California recently finalized the nation's first science-based network of MPAs, stretching from Oregon to the U.S.-Mexico border. This network of 124 protected areas was created to safeguard the productivity and diversity of marine life and habitats for future generations. Desalination plants with infrastructure sited in or near MPAs would likely result in significant impacts from intakes and brine discharge to resources within protected areas. Additionally, desalination plants sited in proximity to MPAs may reduce larval connectivity between protected areas through entrainment and impingement, thereby compromising the effectiveness of the broader network. Appropriate siting of desalination facilities is critical to ensure the long-term success of California's MPA network. As such, we appreciate the clear statement in the draft policy that intake structures and discharges for desalination facilities will not be located within MPAs or state water quality protected areas. We also support the language stating that discharges should be sited at a sufficient distance as to have no impact on MPAs or state water quality protected areas. However, the criteria for avoiding impacts from discharges is currently limited to salinity. The board should establish additional criteria such as thresholds for chemicals like coagulants or antifoulants that will be used to determine that discharges are having no impact on protected areas. We also appreciate and support the language that to the extent feasible, intakes shall be sited to maximize the distance between MPAs and state water quality protected areas. However, consistent with CEQA requirements, potential impacts on other important ecological features such as a kelp bed or canyon head or other productivity hotspots should be analyzed even if they occur outside of a protected area. Intakes should be sited to minimize impacts to important ecological features in addition to maximizing their distance from MPAs or state water quality protected area boundaries. Finally, the board will need to reconcile the language in the recently approved Ocean Plan Amendment that creates a new designation to protect water quality within MPAs with the language in this desalination amendment. The previous amendment regarding general protection for state water quality protected areas states that no new surface water seawater intakes shall be established within state water quality protected area general protection, and goes on to state that this does not apply to sub-seafloor intakes where studies are prepared showing there are no predictable entrainment or impingement of marine life. This language is inconsistent with the proposed desalination amendment, which proposes any intake structures within marine protected areas or state water quality protected areas. We recommend adjusting the previous amendment on general protections to match the related provision in the desalination amendment. Thanks again for your opportunity to provide feedback on the draft policy and your continued efforts to protect water quality within California's protected areas.
Thank you.
On that last point, are staff, are you aware of any potential conflicts where a subsurface intake is proposed nearer in a MPA or SWQPA?
I'm not aware of any specific ones that are proposed, but we did realize going through that the most recent Ocean Plan Amendment had some language on intakes that our intent was to reconcile, so we'll take a look at their comments, certainly.
Okay, good.
Good morning,
Good
Chair,
morning.
board members.
Thank you for returning. You get a medal for joining us both days.
They're all blurring together.
Both days, all day, all issues.
That's right.
Yeah, keeping an eye on that
Notice
ocean
for
plan.
trash, he actually wore a tie, though.
Well, I felt like that was
that's
the
appropriate, I think.
yeah, that was the hearing. I only have one suit, so I didn't want to wear the same thing for you guys.
You think we
2
would have
days in a
busted you?
row.
Yeah, right.
That would have been awkward.
Have you ever seen my husband? He always wears the same suit. A different shirt, different tie. Who knows?
I have different pants.
It
on,
only
too.
takes two.
For the record, my name is Sean Bothwell. I'm the staff attorney for the California Coastkeeper Alliance. We represent 12 California waterkeepers statewide. Before I get started on my substantive comments, I'm going to do something I've never done before. I would like to suggest that the board consider a possible 30-day extension on the comment period. And the reason for that is, two major policies came out pretty closely together, as we were just joking about, the trash policy and the desal policy. And, I understand the intent behind this kind of new strategy of let's do a lot of stakeholder engagement beforehand, talk before it's released, do a lot of the work beforehand before it hits the street so that you can get it done really quickly, and I completely support that. But unlike the trash policy, which came out remarkably similar to what was going on throughout the stakeholder process, this desal policy is quite different than what we were looking at during the stakeholder process. And it got a lot more complicated, to be honest with you. So, we've always been pushing to get these policies out and done as quickly as possible. I don't want to delay that whatsoever. But just the shortest extension that you guys usually give would be something we'd really appreciate. Getting back to the substantive issues, I think it's important to look at this policy in the lens of implementation. Because if you look at it just on a statewide view, it actually looks pretty good. It has this preferred alternative of subsurface intakes. It covers all the major facilities, and it really looks at each element in the law as required. And we appreciate that stuff. But when you look at it on an implementation project by project basis, and the discretion that's now given to the regional board, and the history that we've already seen, I'm concerned that this policy doesn't move us forward enough, and that there's so much discretion that we're really just back to best professional judgment at the regional board level. So that gets us to best available that Joe touched on earlier. And again, the law requires best available site design, technology, and mitigation. And the policy does a very good job at the beginning to highlight that the regional board will do this analysis, look at each best available design, best available site, best available technology, best available mitigation, and then do the combination at the end. But that's where the analysis stops for best available, because then once you get into each one of the elements, instead of setting what is the best available, it really allows criteria under the feasibility of allowing the permittee to dictate really what they want. And so that gets into the feasibility analysis, let's call it. I wouldn't even call it a definition in the best available technology section. And it lists a suite of different factors, and really I see those as just opportunities for permittees to be, I don't want to do subsurface intakes, and here's all the different reasons I can show that my project that I designed can't meet that. And that's not what we did with Wantsu Cooling. Wantsu Cooling, we set a BAT, a technology that needed to be met, and then it was a very tough threshold, definitional threshold for them to get to that second track. And that's not what you see here when you see the feasibility analysis. And so unfortunately, as Joe had discussed earlier, we've seen this before where the project proponent comes with the site already decided, the design capacity already decided, and then try to fit square in the round hole, and they'll be able, it's very simple to just hire the consultant and prove that the project that they want to propose meets what's in this policy right now, because the feasibility analysis really is just wide open and pretty weak. So that gets me to cost. So subsurface intakes, we think the cost of subsurface intakes are no different than the cost in cooling towers. There's no justification for the Wantsu cooling policy. You decided not to consider cost when you did this feasibility analysis. And under the policy here, there's no justification as why you're changing that philosophy. And the reason behind the Wantsu cooling decision was because it's very easy to calculate the cost of compliance. How much does the cooling tower cost? But it's nearly impossible to calculate the cost of the compliance benefit. How much fish is saved? What is the cost, economic cost to the marine environment? That was your justification for Wantsu cooling, and it should be the same justification here. It's the same kind of issues, same type of impacts, and I don't see the rationale for why you would look at cost in one and not look at cost in the other. Innovative technologies. So the policy allows for these innovative alternative technologies to be used, and we completely agree with that approach. The way we see this best available technology standard is you find the best available, you determine its performance level, and then you allow other technologies to be designed that meet that similar level. That was the idea behind the Clean Water Act, that it's be a technology forcing statute. And I understand the conversation earlier about if it's an existing facility, there might be some issues there. But the fact still remains that if you're going to come up with an innovative new technology, it needs to meet that best available technology. Currently, the way the policy is written is you only have to meet that secondary approach, which is subsurface screens, which we find to be a very dramatic decrease from the best available. The last thing I want to touch on is design. And I actually think this is one of the most understated parts of the policy because, in my mind, design capacity is a critical part of this policy, and it's nowhere in the design component of this policy as currently written. And if you actually look at the design section, just reading between the lines, I actually feel like staff had a very difficult time coming up with what is the design criteria that needs to be in there. I think a lot of the criteria that's there should probably either be in the site or the technology section. I don't think it necessarily applies to design. And I think I know 3 of them out of the 5 are very repetitive. They're the same questions you're asking. And I think it's just this difficulty of, we don't want to touch design capacity, so let's try to come up with other components. And I think the argument that you'll hear is, if you look at best design, if you put capacity in and you look at it on its own when you do this analysis, well, what's the best design capacity? One could argue that it's 0, and that's obviously not a realistic thing. But in my mind, it's 0 because it results in 0 marine life mortality, right? That's the idea behind why 0 would be the best. But if you have a capacity that accommodates and complements what a subsurface intake would be, you get the same results, 0 marine life mortality by having the subsurface intake. So in my mind, the best design isn't 0. It's the same standard of 0 marine life mortality by being able to accommodate the subsurface intakes. So with that, I'll conclude. I think I want to reiterate what Joe had said, that one of the biggest troubles we're having is we like how the analysis is designed, but there really isn't any criteria or any explanation as how you combine them at the end. And if you don't have that, then you're really just leaving it up to best professional judgment, and we're at the same place that we've always been with these permits in the past. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. I think there seems to be agreement on the need for more clarity across the board as well, but thanks for flagging each of those. Question?
The issue of an extension, actually from my colleagues and others, what...
I want to wait till we're done today and then think about it.
Okay, then, but we should make a decision today in terms of recommendation, because otherwise nobody knows if they've got more time or not.
I have Sean. So we've talked before regarding some efforts on your part in the environmental community to take a look at maybe suggesting certain areas, suggesting certain sites. So I'm wondering if you could comment on that. And then also, I think I understand what you're saying as far as needing to look at this criteria with respect to each of the factors. But would you be open to considering some flexibility on site selection in areas where there are existing industrial sites?
Yeah, I absolutely, Chair Member Marcus actually had raised that earlier, and I was going to address that when it came to Joe's comments. I think we still need to think through that, but I definitely think there should be flexibility for expanded and existing facilities, particularly to site. I actually think that's something that's missing in the policy, that for expanded facilities, since they are already constructed, that site should be something that there should be flexibility in that analysis. And I wouldn't hold them to the same standards for site that you would for new facilities.
So when you say existing facilities, industrial areas, power plants, I mean, what exactly do you mean by existing facilities?
Well, I just mean, as the way it's defined under the policy was all I meant by that.
So my question would be beyond that, say in industrial areas where there are existing power plants, I haven't read the policy that closely to know if it's already incorporated under existing facilities.
No, it's not.
Okay.
The concept that that an existing intake, like a power plant, should have be allowed under the policy is one that we considered, and we're not. So staff is not supporting an existing intake means an existing infrastructure. It would need to go through this analysis for subsurface intake.
Okay, so if we were to tighten up the criteria, as you suggest, under each of the factors, if you look at the factor regarding the analysis on site, do you feel that tightening it up, do you feel that there should be some allowance for industrial sites, not existing facilities as defined, but beyond that? In other words, how to encourage development. I mean, if we tighten this up so much, that maybe there would be an appropriate subsurface intake that would be adjacent to an existing industrial site. Does that necessarily make sense? Kind of expanding the industrial zone along the coastline? Or should there be some flexibility in areas where there are existing industrial sites that wouldn't necessarily be
Oh,
subsurface?
so you're meaning the onshore impact.
Mhm.
Interesting.
I think when it comes to site, I'm not completely sure I understand the question, but I think what needs to be the focus is the site being able to mitigate the marine life mortality and intake. Do you understand?
So,
This
yeah,
tie would look good with your shirt, too. Sorry.
So I think from a coastal zone management perspective, there is some benefits to co-locating industrial facilities in the same site. As far as the infrastructure is concerned, if you're talking about cooling the pipe for the cooling water intake, and we just got done prohibiting using those pipes, so there's really no benefit in using it alone as an intake. But what we're finding in Huntington, one of the alternatives they're exploring is constructing galleries and using that intake pipe as a conduit for the smaller pipes coming out of the galleries, right? So I think that there are some circumstances where those power plants may be useful, both from a coastal zone management perspective and from using that infrastructure, but not to the extent where you say, well, look, there's already an open ocean intake, why don't I just use that? Well, you don't use that because that's clearly not the best technology. And if you can use it for some other purpose, more power to you, but not